Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending today. I am Karen Kirsch from Citizen Action of Wisconsin. We are here today to talk about and celebrate the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act. President Joe Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law a week ago yesterday, Tuesday, August 16th. And just a few days before that, Congresswoman Gwen Moore was working hard for Wisconsinites on a Friday night as she was finally able to pass this piece of legislation that she had been working on for well over a year. And the reason why we are so happy that to talk about this piece of legislation is that it will bring down the price of prescription drugs, health insurance, and home energy. It will help tackle the climate crisis that threatens our communities with fires, floods, and droughts. And it is fully paid for. We will go into more detail about the legislation itself and how it's paid for with this great lineup that I have for you today. So I will go ahead and introduce the lineup, and then we will start with our first speaker. We will be taking questions at the very end, and you can go ahead and submit those questions in the Q&A section of the webinar. So let's start with our lineup. So first we have Mary Yonker. Mary is a Milwaukee area retiree that is on Medicare, and she has significant prescription drug costs that she's going to be talking to us today about. We also have Congresswoman Gwen Moore. Then we have esteemed attorney Mike Van Someren, who's going to help us understand some of the tax loopholes that were closed. And then finally, Dr. Robert Kraig of Citizen Action of Wisconsin, who is very involved in working on the climate crisis in Wisconsin. And he will talk about what this piece of legislation means to people that care about the climate crisis in Wisconsin. So I did have Mary go first because I wanted the Congresswoman to hear directly from someone that she was able to help by passing this piece of legislation. More importantly, Mary has significant prescription drug costs, and she will be helped by the insulin monthly drug cost cap of $35 per month. And I'm sure Congresswoman Moore will go into more detail after Mary speaks. And then she's also going to be helped by the Part D $2,000 prescription drug cap. So Mary, go ahead and talk to us, tell us a little bit about yourself and talk to us about your prescription drug struggles. Oh, you're on mute, Mary.
Thank you, Karen. Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to participate in talking about the recent changes to Medicare, because not only do I think it will help many people, I know it will help me directly. I would like to thank you, Congresswoman Moore, for your work on the Inflation Reduction Act. I appreciate it so much, and I know many people in this country do. I'm a type 2 diabetic who requires insulin 4 times a day. 3 years ago, I went on Medicare, and later into my first year, I fell into the donut hole. Now, I had heard about the donut hole, but I really didn't know what it was because my insurance didn't have the donut hole. And so I never had any problems with my prescriptions or my insulin. I learned fast when I went to pick up my insulin prescription at my pharmacy and was told that the copay was $800 for a 3-month prescription. I was shocked. I had to make difficult decisions, which caused anxiety. How do I continue to take my required dosage? This took so much of my time trying to figure out what I should do. I'm on a fixed income and I live alone. I already had to closely watch my budget, but it needed to be adjusted to allow for the increase in the insulin cost. Prescription drugs are not an option for many people. for all people. They're necessary to keep you alive. And I don't think that anyone should be put in a position to take their medication or not. Those decisions aren't decisions we should have to make in our country. Since then, I have monitored my insulin usage. I've changed my eating and exercise habits more than I had before, and luckily have been able to stay out of the donut hole for the last 2 years. This takes a lot of time and energy, and it causes a lot of worry because at any time I could fall back into it. And you don't really know when you're going to fall into that donut hole because your invoices that you get from your drug company don't come until the month after. So, even though you're monitoring a little bit, you don't totally know unless you're adding up all those costs of the prescription drugs that come with a little sheet of paper that they give you at the pharmacy. And even with these changes I made, the cost of my insulin is more than $35 a month. This change will have a positive effect on my living conditions, and I really appreciate it. Again, Congresswoman Moore, I thank you for allowing me and many other diabetic individuals have the ability to afford their insulin and improve their living conditions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. So Congresswoman Moore, we thought you could detail for us some of the things that Mary just spoke to, and then also some of the things in the climate package as well. Take it away. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Citizen Action, Karen, Mary. Why can't you afford $800 a month for your medicine? I mean, of course, that's ridiculous to even try to sit down and try to put together a budget around an expense like that. Hi, everybody. This is Congresswoman Gwen Moore, just never ceasing to be shocked about how we can just leave people like Mary behind. But it's really good to be here today because that frustration, I can't take credit. I mean, it wasn't just me. It's been decades of Democrats who have fought to be able to bring these prescription drug prices down. And the Inflation Reduction Act, to paraphrase President Joe Biden, the Inflation Reduction Act is a big deal. With this once in a generation bill, Democrats lowered the cost of healthcare. They helped build a fair tax system, and I'm on the tax committee. So we're finally getting some historic investments done in clean energy. Never anything like this in the history of the United States. It's going to help us get toward our goals, 2030 carbon-free goals. Also, it's going to create jobs in the process and be able to make electric cars and heating systems more affordable for working Americans. This is a big deal. And I say Democrats, unfortunately, because this was not a bipartisan bill. The Inflation Reduction Act, for as much as people talk about inflation, was a Democrats only bill. I mean, not a single Republican voted for. I can go on and on and on, but I know that we're limited. And so I just want to highlight some of the key provisions that I think is going to change lives. Really glad to be joined by this esteemed panel. Dr. Kraig is here to talk with some details about the healthcare bill. Mary has already shared with you her lived experience, and I think Mike is going to come along and really burrow into some of the tax provisions and how the clean energy provisions are going to really work. But with this bill, Medicare will be able to negotiate the cost of the most expensive drugs that Americans depend on. Something Democrats, no matter who tells you this, have been working toward for many years. And as a matter of fact, I'm just get off the subject for a minute because it just sends me crazy, that when this deal was struck, to lower these costs, Republicans got so angry that they wouldn't pass the health care bill for veterans who had suffered and died from those burn pits for years, something that had been entirely bipartisan. They retaliate by not initially voting for that bill. I mean, to show their shame. And of course, Big Pharma didn't like it. They put out commercials claiming that there won't be any more inventions or discoveries. And that's all ridiculous, because the National Science Foundations, universities, they are making record profits and lowering the cost of prescription drugs for Americans, and to give us some parity with the rest of their customers is only fair. They make a good profit, and beyond a good, decent profit and paying your shareholders, beyond that, it's just price gouging. Seniors should be able, like Mary, should be able to afford the medicine that they have to, without sitting there trying to figure out where to come up with $800 out of their rent and food allowance. It's absurd. They shouldn't have to skip paying bills or to go hungry to be well. And that's why this vital legislation also caps Medicaid patients' monthly out-of-pocket expenses for insulin at $35, starting in just a few months. So this is, a lot of these things you won't see right away, but this is going to start soon and very soon. And starting in 2025, out-of-pocket Medicare D drug costs will be capped at $2,000 a year, benefiting nearly 900,000 Wisconsin residents. Really proud of that. I was so upset that the GOP senators blocked a measure, not a single vote, that would have extended the insulin cap to people in the private sector. But our Senator Ron Johnson, of course, shouldn't have been surprised that he didn't vote for that, because as Maya Angelou so famously said, when people tell you who they are, you need to believe them the first time. We also extended the cost of the cost-saving ACA, the Affordable Care Act, premium subsidies, which were part of the rescue plan, ensuring that individuals on the ACA exchanges do not pay more than 8.5% of their income for health care premiums, and that low American incomes could enroll in a $0 premium plan. I mean, we are just so close to universal health care with these kinds of changes. I mean, this is a big deal. Because of enhancements to the ACA and the American Rescue Plan, we helped 7,000 people in the district that I represent to get health care, and 74,000 people statewide. And with this bill, folks, an estimated 13 million people nationwide, 13 million nationwide will see lower premiums at the end of this year. This is a really big deal. Clean energy, again, we've enacted significant provisions to fight climate change. The IRA supports low-cost financing for clean energy projects with a focus on equity and environmental justice, including provisions to help ensure that low-income communities that bear the burden of climate change are not overlooked. As a matter of fact, there's a $3 billion in environmental and climate justice block grant program to help vulnerable communities. And some of the tax credits have bonuses for serving these underserved communities. We also make clean energy appliances and electric vehicles more affordable, using the tax code and tax credits for the people instead of just to the wealthiest people and people, who can afford a Tesla. And all together, these tax benefits could save Americans up to $1,000 in energy costs each year. $1,000 a year in energy cost savings. That's real money, y'all. That's a big deal. And I'm so proud that my proposal to lower the cost of home energy by providing people with audits so that they can see how to make their investments and to incentivize them lowering their energy costs and fight climate change, made it into this really ambitious package. And there's a strong labor provision included to help ensure that this legislation creates good paying jobs in America. And I was really proud to shepherd those things. You know, independent analysts have estimated that the clean energy provisions just by themselves will create more than 900,000 jobs a year for the next decade. 900,000 a year. And guess what, y'all? This bill is not only fully paid for, but reduces the deficit. How did we do it? By asking the wealthy and big corporations to just pay their fair share, including by requiring that large companies with $1 billion in profits and more pay a minimum of 15% tax. We remember in some of them were paying no tax. And to cut through some of the GOP lies, I just got to do this before I sign off. There are no new federal income taxes on anyone making less than $400,000 a year. We provide these funds to adequately staff the IRS that has been purposely and deliberately drained by Republicans for decades. They've done it to protect their big donors. An underfunded and understaffed IRS has meant that the wealthy and the largest corporations have been able to use every trick in the book to skip paying their taxes. And this bill gives the IRS the funding it needs to do its job and support enforcement of existing tax laws on the wealthiest tax dodgers. The likelihood of getting an audit is much greater for you if you're poor, because a lot of that is just automatic. It's done by automatic machines. The more sophisticated audits, Republicans have deliberately prevented the IRS from doing that with these staff shortages. This bill is not perfect, of course. I've never voted for a perfect bill, but I am not forgetting stuff that's left on the table. Priorities like paid family leave, paid medical leave, efforts to keep those in the Medicaid coverage gap covered and denied health care because of GOP sabotage, affordable child care, and maternal health investments, and of course, my child tax credit. But I will close by saying that the Inflation Reduction Act is a game changer. And really, it puts people above politics. And I yield back to you, Karen.
Thank you, Congresswoman Moore. And thank you for also remembering to mention the Badger Care expansion money that Wisconsin has long turned down for over 10 years. Very important. We're going to get it this time around. I'm faithful and I'm hopeful. So one of the things that inevitably comes up is, how are you going to pay for it, right? And you did mention a tax proposal that will help pay for it. And I have Mike Van Someren here that I actually saw him speak about this a little bit. He's an attorney, and he also has another title right now that he'll tell us about. But he was particularly good at speaking to some of these tax loopholes. So I invited him here today. So Mike, do you want to go through and just tell us about how are we going to pay for it, and what are some of these loopholes that you have studied?
Sure. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Citizens Action, for allowing me to be on here. And thank you, Congresswoman, for your leadership on this bill, now law. And, I'm looking forward to, God willing, joining you in the fight for the middle class in Congress next year. So that is my other title. I'm now a candidate for Congress going against Scott Fitzgerald in the neighboring 5th. But getting to the point, the Congresswoman talked about the biggest one, the alternative minimum tax for corporations. And she pointed out, rightfully so, that this isn't a 15% minimum tax on every corporation. This is a 15% minimum tax on the top 200 corporations, I think is where the number falls. Companies making net revenue, which is roughly profits. Whenever you're talking taxes, you have to put that caveat that there's a lot of details and a lot of exceptions, but generally speaking, it's companies making over $1 billion in profit each year. So, this manifests in a couple of ways. One, if companies are making a lot of profit, they can afford to pay 15% minimum tax. Alternatively, if they want to avoid the tax, they can invest in themselves. We allow companies to deduct most of the cost to do business and make money. That includes paying wages, paying benefits, buying equipment, expanding operations, things like that. And when they make those investments, especially in wages and benefits for people, what does that do? That allows for more consumer spending. We are an economy that's 70% consumer spending based. That's good. That increases business opportunities, not only for those companies that are paying their people more, but for other companies that rely on those dollars. And so it's what they call a virtuous cycle in capitalism. The other aspect of this is the increased enforcement. And the Congresswoman hit the nail on the head here, obviously. It's the fact that right now, when you have the IRS, which is underfunded and undermanned, and I would also add that they're often denigrated. The first people that are going to leave an organization in the private sector, when you start cutting wages or start devaluing the people, are the ones who are the top performers, because they're going to have the most opportunity to go elsewhere. So this will allow us to get some of the better candidates for IRS enforcement in there that can go after the bigger tax schemes and make sure that the loopholes that we intend to close are actually closed. The other thing I would add is that there's an excise tax on stock buybacks. That is a huge, one thing that was given up that was talked about was the idea that carried interest, which I won't get into the details of that because that's incredibly complicated, but we gave on carried interest and instead went for a stock buyback tax. And I personally think that's a good trade because of the fact that what stock buybacks do is, prior to the 1980s, they were illegal because they were a form of stock manipulation. And then the SEC and the federal government took a different stance on it. And we have spent more money on stock buybacks than we have on R&D. So we are losing innovation and we are losing the ability to be on the cutting edge of products because the money is being used to inflate shareholders' value and shareholders' returns without getting any taxes, because a lot of times what can happen is you can borrow against your portfolio. So the very, very wealthy that have huge amounts of stock, and all of a sudden that value just keeps going up because the companies that they're investing in are using that money to all of a sudden, inflate the value without actually increasing sales or doing anything to organically grow that bottom line. It allows for them to borrow and have even more spending power without actually having to pay any tax on that income. And so it shifts the burden to the middle class, the people that don't have a huge stock portfolio to borrow against, the people like you and me and most of the people, I'm assuming everybody on this call that relies on wages or small business income. We don't have a multi-million-dollar stock portfolio that we can borrow against and live our lives on. So those three things there are going to raise revenue and also shift the burden to the upper class in a way that doesn't actually add new taxes other than the alternative minimum tax. And it goes after what I would call is the real fair share, which is what the law already says should be paid and just isn't being collected due to a lack of enforcement and lack of ability to enforce.
Thank you so much. So those will go a long way to evening the playing field. And I did just want to mention, because I do follow the healthcare beat, that we will save significant money by allowing Medicare to negotiate the drug prices, which we've been long fighting for that. So up next is Dr. Robert Kraig, who will speak to some of the climate action items in the budget and what it'll mean to Wisconsin to have the Inflation Reduction Act.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks everyone for joining us, and especially Congresswoman Moore. Let me just say that before I transition into climate, the key thing about the Inflation Reduction Act, which was, you know, a great surprise, we could get something this strong and good, but as the Congresswoman pointed out, not everything we want, but a building block. We heard about the healthcare advances. I mean, my goodness, the big drug company lobby has not suffered any legislative setback in decades. It's supposed to be the unbeatable force. And this is a critical precedent. This starts the process of negotiating over physician drug prices, which every other advanced industrial country does. Our country spends the most to develop these drugs, then we grant an unregulated monopoly where they can price gouge out of it. And we start in this bill, or I should say we, the Congress and the representative, with the 20 most expensive drugs, but you can build that out to make that universal. So it's a great step forward, but you can build it out. Just like Social Security was much smaller when it started under FDR than the way it was built out. But once you had it, the political momentum was very strong to keep adding to it, especially when you have a lot of drugs not covered. And we heard from Mary about the consequences now of giving Wall Street traded companies the unregulated right to charge whatever they want. And if they're making 50% profit, why not 60? Why not 70? And that's how they price someone like Mary out of a life-saving and life-sustaining medication. On the tax code, as Mike really expressed it very, very well, it's a breakthrough that we now have a minimum tax. We have seen over the last 40 years just a supercharging of loopholes so that the wealthiest corporations, and that's where wealthy, ultra-rich people come from, their money comes out of corporations, right, have been able to avoid their responsibility back to the community and do things such as non-Irish companies claim the profits in Ireland or the Cayman Islands, other tax shelters, and avoid any of their responsibility for all that we give them, all the infrastructure we buy, all of the educated workforce we provide. And so Mike puts it very well, the way to avoid this minimum tax, the only way is to avoid it, because it's on booked profits. It's not on after all your deductions. The only way to avoid this is things like invest more in this country, i.e. create more jobs, or raise wages, i.e. help the average person. And so there's a tax loophole, but it isn't about finding the right lure to find the right tax shelter, all the wrong incentives. It's the right incentives. They could reduce their profit to zero if they wanted and pay none of this tax, but it'd be because they were investing it all in their workers and in their physical infrastructure here in the United States. And when you think about deindustrialization, we needed these incentives 40 years ago when the process of deindustrializing Milwaukee started. And that's my segue to climate. Look, this is the biggest amount of expenditures, and they're not net expenditures because of the taxes. This is more than paid for. This bill actually reduces the budget deficit. Unlike the Republican rhetoric, they talk about deficits, they increase it whenever they have full power, and they've run it up the most under Bush, Trump, and before them, Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. And so this is the first serious effort our country has undertaken on climate change. We had some good initial policies, but they weren't as much as he had hoped for with President Obama, with the failure of his legislative initiatives there. But we have known that we're facing a catastrophic climate change that risks human civilization and the lives of billions of people since the 1980s with a scientific certainty. And the government federal government has either failed to act or actually made it worse with a lot of the subsidies for fossil fuels. And so this is a huge step forward and we need to do more, but it's amazing how far this goes. This is what surprised a lot of people. We know this and we've committed to it globally. We have to cut emissions by 45% by 2030 to have a fighting chance to prevent runaway climate change. And that's 45% of 2005 emissions levels. So it's more than 45% of current emission levels. We need to get that and more, and we need to keep going after that to reduce even further by 2040 and 2050. If we didn't have this bill, because the Republicans may, because of gerrymandering, take back the House and block all legislation. We hope they don't. They may not, but they may. There was a deadline here. Budget reconciliation, the Senate had to pass in September, or we wouldn't have another chance potentially for 2, 4, 6 years with a 2030 deadline. This gets us 80% of the way. This bill gets us a net 40% reduction. And that is huge for the whole world, including Wisconsin and Milwaukee, but we're part of the world, right? So that matters a great deal. And so we need to be aware of that. There were some painful compromises forced by Senator Manchin that affect frontline communities in the Gulf Coast and the West. We need to fix those, but you had to do that in order to give us a chance to prevent billions of deaths internationally, and billions of deaths that we disproportionately people of color, because the Southern Hemisphere will suffer the most and they produce very little of the carbon in the atmosphere. So if you want racial injustice on a scale beyond anything we've ever seen in human history, runaway climate change is it, and we have an obligation to prevent it. But just so you know, in the worst case scenarios of how much additional gas and oil drilling there will be, the climate benefits, the emissions reduction benefits outweigh them 24 to 1. That's worst case, and best case, more like 80 to 1. So this is a net positive bill, but the Congresswoman knows you sometimes have to make painful compromises to move forward and then be committed to fixing them. And that's why we need a working majority in the US Senate to remove those provisions. But at this point, we absolutely have to move forward. And this is a huge thing for Milwaukee. And Congresswoman pointed out some of the features of the over $360 billion in climate investments in this bill. But understand that if we make this climate conversion, not only are we preventing a catastrophe, if we do it right, we're setting up an era of unparalleled opportunity and growth and equitable economic growth and development. And we've seen income inequality get worse and worse for 4 decades. Milwaukee should be at the front of the line for this. And there is a lot of work being done on this, because we were one of the most prosperous cities in the country up to the late 1970s. We were called the Star of the Snow Belt by the New York Times. And we had the most prosperous African-American middle class in the country because we were one of the last outposts of the Great Migration. We had those great manufacturing jobs, those union jobs. And the allowing the ultra-rich conservatives, corporate America, to rejigger this economy, to have unregulated outsourcing so they can search for cheap labor overseas or in other parts of the country, has devastated Milwaukee. It's why we have some of the worst racial economic disparities, perhaps the worst, based on which numbers you look at, in the country. And of the top 50 metro areas in the country, we're ranked near the bottom or last in many of those measures. We have an opportunity to change all that and create a whole new economy. And the Congresswoman pointed this out. The thing we're working on now is we're working on the city and the county committed to do this, created a city-county task force on climate and economic equity that is trying to both meet the climate target, but do it in a way that advances economic equity dramatically. These are exactly the investments we need, and the city doesn't have the resources, partly because the state starves them for resources, partly because it takes billions. Right now, you see solar roofs going up, the solar panels on roofs going up. In my neighborhood in Bayview, which is more prosperous in Milwaukee, a Milwaukee neighborhood in the suburbs, right, and other places, you don't see it in the north side where they have the highest energy burden. That is, they have the most energy inefficient homes, they're older, and they have the lowest incomes. You don't see it there because it's tax credits, it's green mortgages where you do a refi. They don't have access to those things. I'm told by business experts in Milwaukee who do this kind of work, who are allies of ours, that the incentives in this, not only for, as the Congressman pointed out, for things like the energy efficient appliances, but also for heat pumps and whole new HVAC systems, and for insulation and other energy conservation measures, renewable energy are enough to pay the whole bill for low-income homeowners and low-income, homeowners of rental properties. And as a result, we can bring these benefits to all the people left out. And we also can do our part to prevent a climate genocide. And so this will help fund the whole plan the City County Task Force on Climate Economic Equity is already developing, because this is the beginning of the resources, and it's a huge number of them. And there's a whole lot. I will not go into all the line items, but this can transform Milwaukee. And here's what I'll close on. I think this has benefits just in aggregate, if you just look at what it does. But we're in a situation now in terms of how government works, that what a local area does with such resources makes a huge difference. That if Milwaukee had, and that was our vision for making this plan for Milwaukee through the task force, if we had on-the-shelf plans to take advantage of the money would come, because the climate crisis is so bad. It is coming thanks to the Democratic Congress and President Biden. And as a result, we're in a position to put Milwaukee at the forefront of economic development again. And this time to do it in a way like we had in the 70s and the 60s and the 50s that raises all boats and makes Milwaukee a true mecca for economic opportunity for everyone in our society. And so I'm excited that this has happened, but now how well it helps Milwaukee and how it helps other cities around the state, like Eau Claire, like Madison, and rural areas will depend on what they do locally to set up the infrastructure, to take advantage of it and build around it and get the most possible bang for the buck. So thank you, Congresswoman, for doing what is one of your central roles in Congress, that is bringing the bacon home. And now we need to make good use of that bacon with your help, and then you're going to be working to get us more bacon on healthcare, on tax fairness, and of course on climate and the economic transition we need to make to create a truly equitable economy that lifts all boats. I will turn it back to our talented MC, Karen.
Thank you, Robert. Yes, the possibilities for Wisconsin are certainly exciting. So we are entering the question and answer area part of the program. So if you wanted to ask a question, I'll give you a little bit of time to answer, to put that into the Q&A section. I do have a question myself for Mary. Mary, can you talk a little bit about how the changes in Medicare, and you heard the Congresswoman talk about the additional ACA subsidies as well that will help people on the ACA marketplace. Can you talk a little bit how that will help your family and friends?
Well, a majority of the people that I know, it's going to have the extension of the subsidies are going to help them. It's really bad when, you don't have health insurance. You're not old enough to get Medicare and you've retired a little early for various reasons, and you find yourself without health insurance. A person close to me, my sister, will be retiring in a few months. She won't have health insurance until she's eligible for Medicare. And so she's going to be purchasing a plan on the ACA marketplace. So extending these subsidies is going to personally help her. And all these, everything that we've been talking about is going to put more disposable income into the hands of seniors and many of it other people, but seniors. And our tendency probably is to spend it, which will help the economy. I mean, it all kind of works together. The more disposable income we have, the more we spend, the better the economy gets.
And there you go. That's very insightful, Mary. Thank you so much. So Congresswoman Moore, is there anything additional that you would like people to know about the Inflation Reduction Act before we close it out?
Well, thanks for, yielding back to me. once upon a time in my life, I remember complaining and saying, oh, I want to do this and I want to do that and I want to do the other thing. And it reminds me so much of how the Republicans have really hammered this message about inflation and how it's hurting people. Well, I'll say to them what this person said to me. Are you going to talk about it or be about it? So they have talked about inflation, something that really is nobody's fault. It's a global problem. It's not Joe Biden's fault. If we want to go down that road, we could talk about some of the irresponsible tax cuts and tax breaks and spending and, buying back stocks and stuff that contributed to the inflation if we want to go down that path. But they have talked about inflation and they have done not a single thing about it. And so this package, even though it spends over $300 billion, it really creates the income by making corporations pay their fair share and not gouging them either. And it doesn't raise taxes for a single person making under $400,000 a year, a promise that Joe Biden made. So when people say the Democrats have been wonderful, they created Social Security, they created Medicare, they created Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act. They were, when they say all that and then say, what have you done for me lately? The Inflation Reduction Act.
Very good. That was a good way to end. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We're very excited about this piece of legislation, and we just wanted to celebrate and talk about it a little bit. And I think it was a great informative session for everyone. Thank you and have a wonderful day.